podcast on the topic of Nepal, India, and China relations. Today, we are very pleased to have Raunab Singh Khatri with us. He is joining us from China. He is attending school at Peking University. He's doing PhD in management and organization, and also runs a project called Araniko Project, which does a very important task of uh, finding out primary data in Mandarin that directly relates to Nepal and China relations. So we're very pleased to have Raunab with us. Before we begin, let me also introduce myself to everyone. My name is Shishir Lamichhane. I'm based here in Kathmandu, and I'm speaking with you all from Kathmandu right now. I work as a deputy registrar at the Supreme Court. I handle and coordinate matters at the constitutional bench at the Supreme Court. And I also teach at National Law College. My area of interest and expertise, or whatever you may say, is national security law. So this area that we are going to talk is also something that is very close and dear to me. And Rona, please, would you want to talk a little bit about your project before we begin?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Shishir. So, hello everyone. My name is Raunab, and I'm currently based in Beijing. As Shishir said, I am doing my PhD in organization and management at Peking University. And I also run the Araniko project. So, like Shishir said, well, we are a research think tank that does a lot of evidence-based research on Nepal and China relations. We have been doing this for 3 years now, and it's nice to be connected with all of you here. Yeah.
Mm. And in fact, this podcast is being conducted from three countries right now. So this SADF that is getting us together, the podcast together, is conducted by SADF, as I said, and it is based in Brussels. It's a think tank based in Brussels that studies and explores South Asia and the European Union, and tries to determine the relations and explore the relationships areas. Um, so let's jump into today's topic that we have Raunab here with us for. That is about China, India, and Nepal relations. How is it going? As we all know, that Nepal is very strategically located when we see the geography. India and China are its neighbors, and it has had relations with them historically. We call we have the historical ties with both the countries, and both the relations are equally important. But there have been upheavals in the history, I mean, one way or the other, and that have shaped the course of our foreign policy with both the countries in some manner. Um, but before we even start talking about India, I think it's important that we start talking about the hot topic right now, that is of our Prime Minister from Nepal, KP Sharma Oli, visiting China recently. So let's start with that, Ronab. How do you see that? Um, what was the main agenda in the visit? Was it just a traditional, some sort of official, formal visit, or was it with some political calculation conducted, or what was it about?
Thank you so much, Shishir. So, yeah, indeed, the topic of the Prime Minister visiting China, I think this time was a very hot topic, and also something that was highly debated in the media and in the popular discourse as well. And definitely this time, the Prime Minister's visit was very significant, particularly because in terms of the approval or not of Pokhara International Airport's loan process, uh, trying to convert loan into grant. And then second was about the Belt and Road framework, the revision of the Belt and Road framework. That was the second, and the third was the overall geopolitical ambitions vis-a-vis India. That's always in the discourse, especially when it comes to China nowadays. And I think, from my understanding, in terms of Pokhara Airport, there has been no discussion, no mention of it whatsoever in any of the agreements, or in any of the throughout the whole visit process. And I do believe that the process of converting loan into grant is not feasible or not possible, because I don't think so. It's very difficult to find evidences in terms of China's infrastructure projects around the world where there has been scenarios or cases where they have converted loans into grants process immediately. And there has been some sort of debt equity swap, like which we have seen with countries like Sri Lanka or something like that, but clearly not conversion of grant process. So I was not very optimistic about that whole process. So that has been sidelined a bit. But I think the Belt and Road Revision framework was somewhat seen as a very how to say success of the foreign policy of Nepal in this course of visit. We saw the agreement being revised by the team based in Kathmandu, the government, from the government, the experts from legal sector, financial sector, economic sector, and those revisions been sent by the foreign ministry. And I think both the parties, the Nepali Congress and the UML coalition, had a very unified voice in terms of strictly taking concessional loans or taking grants for the Belt and Road project. And my my argument in that case was that I my understanding is that it's difficult for Nepal to secure projects, not just secure projects, but also implement projects from China, which takes decades and decades to come into material operationalization. For example, the railway project. And my understanding was that it's far better for Nepal to use projects or to conduct projects with China that can be implemented within a set amount of time, and that can be operationalized and perhaps generate economic returns much faster. Because I think living in China, I think if there's one thing that I am very aware of, it is that they are very fast in
Mhm.
construction of projects, and they're very quick. And um, you know in terms of that, I think some of the projects are very much feasible,
Mhm.
but the others are still, um, it will still take a long years before it can translate into any meaningful action. But
Yeah.
again, like the previous Belt and Road Agreement in 2017, it still depends whether those commitments or those projects that Nepal has signed can be translated into any meaningful action or not. So we are still yet to see
Yeah.
that. For now, that has been sort of a big highlight of Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli's trip to China. And I think those two were perhaps the bigger, meaningful signings that have taken place, especially the BRI
Yeah.
agreement.
And was he KP Sharma Oli able to get any outcome when he came back to Nepal? Like, was he able to achieve any of those agendas that he went for?
Um, in in terms of achieving, I mean, I think China has pledged around 300 million yuan to Nepal, and in terms of achieving any tangible outcomes, in terms of the agreement, yes, signing of the BRI agreement, yes, but whether it still translates into action, we are still not so sure.
Mhm.
And for me personally, I think I will still wait until all those commitments and all those signings can be translated into any meaningful action yet. So, like his previous another visits, it's highly successful, but whether its implementation will remain yet to be seen. Yeah.
Mm. So when we talk of the Belt and Road Initiative and the nine projects that were submitted by Nepal, I mean, initially it was 35 and then it got
Yeah.
down to a single digit number.
Yeah.
There has been no progress so far.
Hmm.
And you also discussed about this in one of your articles
Yeah.
about the potential reasons why there has been no progress. Can you please elaborate some points on why do you think and what are the major reasons behind there being no progress?
Yeah, thank you, Shishir. I think in terms of why there has been no progress, it's very evident because if you look at the timeline of the project, we signed BRI agreement in 2017, and 2017 was already the peak of China's infrastructure financing on Belt and Road Agreement. By 2018, given the US-China trade war, By 2018, the Sri Lanka's debt trap diplomacy started blowing up. And by 2018, a lot of Chinese construction projects, especially in Montenegro, in Indonesia, they started getting a big backlash given their lack of environmental concerns. And before 2019, a lot of Chinese projects didn't even require any environmental standards, or Chinese
Mhm.
companies didn't require like proper environmental standards to, it was just one of those checklists that they had to give to the government. It was not properly implemented. So, um, so meaning that when we signed BRI in 2017, and by the time we went from 35 projects to 9 projects in 2019, China had already become very cautious of those projects. I even sometimes jokingly say to this my friends, like if I was minister in 2017, I would probably assemble as many projects as I can, because it was not that difficult in terms of securing finances to get those infrastructure projects.
Mhm.
And the Chinese called it like no strings attached projects. I think they literally meant it no strings attached at that time, and it was there were lots of financing done. Those countries, some of those countries that has successfully blended those financing and put it into a local context with local laws and regulations, made the Chinese aware of the local customs. They have done really well. For example,
Uh,
the Mombasa port in Kenya,
yeah.
the railway of the Mombasa port in Kenya was constructed within 3 years, right?
Mm.
So it went from 2014, and by the time 2017, it was already finished and it had already been in operation. Even though
Mm.
now they are going for the second phase of the railway, which is a different thing, they could not. The passenger, the revenue earned from the passenger did not really translate into profit for the railway. That's a different issue. But they were able to successfully construct and implement the railway within very set given amount of time. But for a lot of other countries with very weak governance system,
Mm.
and very difficult institutional navigation, it was very difficult. And I think that's when the whole debacle about China's conduct of international finance and infrastructure projects started. But for Nepal, I think we really missed that opportunity throughout those time from
Mm.
2017 onwards. And by the time of 2019, the Chinese had already started focusing more towards sustainable projects. The Ministry of Finance had already released a debt sustainability report. They literally warned the companies to be very careful when about investing abroad. And by 2021, the whole environmental guidelines had already started. So they were very careful in terms of how to what sort of projects to finance in other countries. And I
Mm.
think it
Yeah.
also, the first phase of BRI served as a lesson learning for the Chinese.
Mm.
And I, in my article when I wrote it, my only point was that we have to follow the trend of
Mm.
where the priorities are and maybe secure projects
Yeah.
that aligns with the priorities. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, let's now take one step back,
Hmm.
and we'll again talk about BRI again. But let's go a step back and think about what happened post 2015 after the earthquake.
Hmm.
There was influence, the Chinese influence started growing. There was the blockade, India, I mean, undeclared blockade or whatever we can say, um,
Hmm.
from the Indian side. And then Nepal started realizing that we need alternatives when it comes to um, transit and transportation and bringing in oil into the country. And that was the moment when the Chinese influence started getting higher and higher. And with these visits being frequent than before, how do you think India views this? And as a country with a lot of trade and more relations with India compared to China, we have to be honest. How do you see that India views this, and how do we have to balance, or do we even need to balance it with India, or what do you think? Like in terms of like when we look at it from the Indian perspective.
In terms of looking vis-a-vis India, I think that first of all, Nepal, like we or our political elites or whoever that responsible in power, we have to make both the countries aware of our interest. We have to be very clear with our interest, and I feel like to some degree, it's very difficult to make sense of like recent events. For example, India not willing to purchase hydropower from that's constructed by the Chinese,
Mm.
and and pretty much everything about Nepal-China relations has been vividly looked at very geopolitical lens
Yes.
in India, and to some degree, I still feel that it's our problem, the Nepali uh, foreign policy or those people heading the committee's problem to make very clear of our agenda.
Mm.
And also in terms of India's relation to China, now I think I cannot talk about before because I've mostly based in China, but I interact with a lot of Indian scholars here in Beijing, and I think now India's engagement with China is growing very rapidly.
Mhm.
I think it's pretty much reaching that 2016 phase where I think for me personally, because I came to China in 2016, I saw the peak of India-China relations, I think at that time, with lots of soft power, Indian movies, and then Indian scholars, Indian diplomats, vis-a-vis like Chinese scholars, Chinese diplomats. There was a lot of engagement back then, and we are sort of seeing a very similar trend now in Beijing, where I get to interact with a lot of Indian people and Indian scholars and so on. So the only thing is that, well, in terms of India's relation with China, because both of their relations are growing very rapidly, they still conduct trade with China, right? But when it comes to the neighborhood in South Asia, they have some sort of disagreement with the neighbor. So with Nepal, so I do feel like it's our problem that we
Mhm.
have not been able to really make a firm commitment to both the countries. But at the same time, I still do feel like India needs to change the way it sees
Yeah.
Nepal or the way it sees China's influence in Nepal. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, coming back to BRI again,
Mm-hmm.
uh, India views BRI and also US looks
Mm-hmm.
at BRI as a strategic tool of China to
Mm-hmm.
increase its influence globally. India also presented its position on CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridors, many times that it's coming through, I mean, like it's coming through an disputed territory, the Kashmiri territory. So India was opposed to the CPEC all the time. And it
Mm-hmm.
also views, in many articles, it has presented that um, India views BRI, the rise of BRI in Nepal as a strategy of China to increase its influence.
Mm-hmm.
And there is also that is one part, and the other part is the Sri Lankan example that we saw recently,
Mm-hmm.
where many argued that it was a debt trap diplomacy
Mm-hmm.
by China, and it is a debt trap. BRI in poorer countries, it is a debt trap diplomacy of China. I mean, there are arguments in both sides. Some say it's a debt trap diplomacy, and some say it's just a myth. Um, how do you see it, like the BRI, uh, when you see it in terms of the debt, trap diplomacy? Is it a myth or is it a reality? Um, how do you see it?
Well, in terms of Sri Lanka, I think China's total external debt is very low in Sri Lanka. I think it's somewhere around 10%. So it would be a bit of unjust to call it a debt trap diplomacy, but I think it's also important to acknowledge that some of the projects that China has invested abroad is yet to generate any meaningful returns.
Mhm.
Uh, Even our airport, Pokhara Airport, we are still waiting for proper connectivity flights. So even though they have been able to finish the projects, they have been able to operationalize the projects on time, most of the projects has not generated any returns yet, and I think that's still a problem. But I think calling a debt trap diplomacy is a bit of unjust, I think, to heavily undermine the Chinese influence. But in terms of Belt and Road Initiative, the few things in terms of whether it's CPEC, Nepal, Sri Lanka, or any other countries is the Chinese. Well, basically so you have four big policy banks that the in China, which is the CDB, ICBC, Bank of China, and the Agriculture Bank of China, and then you have a lot of subnational governments, And then on top of that, you have the government agencies like the State Council, NDRC. Um, what I'm trying to say here is that there are so many different actors
Mhm.
participating in the Belt and Road that it's very difficult to justify which project really falls under the Belt and Road initiative and which project not. And but my point is that I think India in particular or other countries, those that oppose the BRI project, I think it's better to look at, okay, um, how can they benefit from the Chinese BRI projects, let's say in Nepal, for example, right? To their own preference. And I think it would be much better to look at it from that perspective. But from my understanding, because China is an economic superpower now in the world, and I think India is still yet to catch up to that level of spending and to that level of providing economic assistance to other countries. So um, it is very important for developing countries to be able to utilize these the China's economic capabilities, um, providing that they also maintain a larger geopolitical
Yeah.
um, uh, agenda. So I would still argue that it's for smaller countries like China is a very essential neighbor now. I think it's difficult to leave to have any conversation without China nowadays, regardless in any development projects. So yeah, so it's much beneficial to look at it from that way. Yeah.
Yeah. And about bringing BRI into Nepal, what other risks do you see associated with that? I'm asking in terms of two kinds of
Mhm,
risk. How do you see them? One being political, because now
mhm,
we have MCC in Nepal, and also there is India.
yeah.
So there could be some political ramifications to having BRIs and a lot of
Mhm,
BRI projects in Nepal. That is one. And the other part being the economic consequences for Nepal, because all the leaders, whichever political party, left or right,
mhm,
they have been focusing on grants or
yeah.
concessional loans. I mean, it's not just about this BRI with China, but Nepal always focuses on grants and concessional loans. But we hear this narrative all the time, even with BRI, that we
Mhm,
want the projects in the form of grants or concessional loans. So,
mhm.
what are these risks associated with bringing BRI into Nepal that you see, the political and economic? What kind of risks, and how do you think we should navigate through those risks?
No, I think that at this point, even the Chinese are very well aware that BRI has become very politicized. So any progress made under it will definitely be seen as a lot in terms of the geopolitical aspect. But if you look at it from the other side, apart from BRI, the cooperation is still going on. Like they just recently signed a financial closure of Manang Marsangdi hydropower project, right? Which is the largest FDI done by Chinese in Nepal. The Himalayan Airlines that conducts flight from Nepali cities to China is also a part of China's FDI to Nepal, right? And you have Chinese cement factories, and then you have Chinese hydropower still working in Nepal, right? So my point is that there are so many projects that are being done under non-BRI, let's call it like a non-BRI projects. And I feel like they are well aware that it's highly politicized. So the biggest risk in terms of political risk would be that none of those projects would ever take off properly, given the fact that they are always under the political um,
Mm,
dilly-dallying between political parties. Maybe tomorrow the coalition would end up and then someone would come and they would not implement the agreement as well. So I think for me, that's the biggest political risk. And also in terms of geopolitics, for example, the railway.
mm,
Um, India is highly opposed to BRI. So tomorrow, if the railway is to happen from Chinese border to Kathmandu city, will we be able to extend it up to India, given the fact that they oppose the BRI agreement? So they would definitely oppose the railway project as well. And I think that is those sort of questions have not been asked yet,
yeah.
and we also don't know what tangible or meaningful we can export to China,
Yeah.
because most of our exports are pretty much like garment industries or
Yep.
raw materials, or it's not high end goods.
Yep.
So we still don't know all those things. So
Yep.
we have like, for larger projects we still have a high economic risk, but there are few projects in terms of transmission lines, for example, where we could really benefit with China, given the fact that India's position has been to not import electricity vis-a-vis China. So maybe in those sectors we can see potential, but for other projects like these larger projects, there are both political risk in terms of not being implemented at all, and economic risk in terms of becoming too large to handle for Nepal.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, connecting to what you just mentioned about if we could export as equally to China, if we have those sort of trade and transit. Please correct me if I'm wrong. There was some data that was submitted by Nepal, where Nepal stated that if we were to have a free trade, some sort of agreement with China, then our GDP would be like minus 0 point something, as compared to what China reported, which would be like 4 point some percentage growth in Nepal's GDP. So there is also uh, difference in the data presented by both the countries. Nepal has already presented the data to China, and I don't think we have received any response from China yet. Do you have any insights on that?
Not really, but it's not very difficult to make that analogy that, first of all, our border is with Tibet, and the population of Tibet is not more than 5 or 600,000, right?
Mm,
It's not a big, I mean, it's highly mountainous, uninhabitable as of now, and to get to the nearest metropolis of big cities, large cities, would be probably Chengdu or in Kunming in Yunnan, which mostly requires connectivity flights as opposed to, you know, as opposed to using the railway, right? And doing a free trade, engaging in a free trade agreement with China would mean that we'll be importing more from them as opposed to exporting anything. Even without free trade, as of now, if you walk around the streets of Kathmandu, you'll still see a lot of Chinese shops already, a lot of Chinese restaurants in Tamil. I read from the Department of Industry the report that they publish every year in terms of number of enterprises, foreign enterprises. I counted them, and there are at least 3,000 Chinese enterprises, small enterprises, the private ones, that are in Kathmandu, Lalitpur. So even without those, we are already seeing so much huge influence, right? It's the scale. They have a huge population, 1.4 billion population. Sometimes I feel like sometimes we just forget how big China is. And given that the enormous scale, even if a few percentage of people migrate to Nepal or like engage in exporting with Nepal, then it's a lot for us, for a country
mm,
like us. So I think we have to be very strategic in terms of what we can export to China as well. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And now let's shift to a little softer topic, but equally important. That is of the study centers.
Yeah.
In a book by former diplomat, the Indian ambassador Ranjit Ray, also mentioned that the situation of the study centers in both the countries, India and Nepal, is very poor. The Nepal Study Center in India is not functioning well, or
Hmm.
not even existent, and the India
Hmm.
Study Center in Nepal is
Hmm.
also going through the same situation. How do you see the study centers in Nepal, India, and China operating? And do you think the situation is getting better? What's the situation like in China? And if you have any insights on India and Nepal, how do you see them? And how do you think we should be dealing with these study centers? And how do you think we should be investing on them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think this is a point that we highly emphasize a lot wherever we go, that, we think that we can understand. Well, we have two dilemmas. First is that we have with India, which is that we think that we understand India because we know the language. We watch Indian movies. We are well aware of their culture. But I think in reality, we really don't. We are not even aware of what happens within the immediate province of India, right? The UP, and just language is, I think, a tool, and then it's a tool to do something else. And you know we we still don't have a good research center or a knowledge center in Nepal that heavily looks into India. Like if I have to go to, okay, if I want to know everything about India, where do I go to in Kathmandu? There is not a single place.
Yeah.
The same is with China. And the same is with India. And we have to really invest in our knowledge production about India. And same is the case with India's centers about Nepal. I've heard that there are just two or three in the Ministry of External Affairs division that looks into entire South Asia. So
Yeah.
it's not even like Nepal or Bangladesh or particular, it's just entire South Asia. So there is very large knowledge gap both from India and from Nepal in terms of understanding each other. And for Nepal, I think we already have a big knowledge gap in terms of understanding China. That is very evident. And we don't, like India, we don't have a research center or knowledge center that really looks into China. We are trying to be one with our blog,
Yeah.
online blog, where we do a lot of translations. We put it out on the internet.
Mhm.
But in terms of China, it's different. There are 15 universities in China now that teach Hindi
Wow.
as their major language.
Mhm.
So, and then there are 5 universities in China that teach Nepali as their major language in the undergraduate. And there are, I think, couple of them that have PhD in Nepali language, right? So they are really investing a lot in understanding like other countries, and they engage in a lot of knowledge production, even though it's all in Mandarin and it's mostly limited for the Chinese audience. So, but they do engage a lot in knowledge production in South Asia. But I think in terms of India's role, or in terms of Nepal role, I see very little.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that's very right, true. With that, we have come to the end of our conversation here in the South Asia Democratic Forum podcast today with Raunab Singh Khatri, who is attending this podcast from Beijing. I encourage everyone who is attending this session with us right now or who will be listening to us in future, please go and visit the Orinoco project. The work is very important. They are directly getting the primary data and translating them into the language that we are familiar with, English. And it's very interesting and it's very insightful to be able to read those and have access to those informations. So having said this, thank you so much, Ronab, again for taking the time to speak with SADF and be a part of this podcast.
Thank you so much, Shishir, and thank you to the SADF as well. It's a pleasure to be here.